It's Friday, the end of another week of isolation, and it's my father's birthday. So today's reading will be is actually inspired by part of his life. And so happy birthday, Dad, who's living in quarantine in his retirement home in Virginia. So that's my dad right there, and my Uncle Glenn. And as I look at them at that picture, that was probably taken when I'm about their age right now. So that's interesting for reflection. Dad is just shy of 90. So one of the reasons I wrote this book was to honor my parents. So there may be some editors that disagree with including this type of material in there. But as the author, I wanted to include it. They're very much alive, and I wanted to honor them by including them in the story, or incorporating fictionalized versions of themselves into the story. So even looking back further, here's a picture, and I look on the back of it, and it says Reims, 1980, and so that's in France, and that's me, and Dad. So I was in college then. I was probably about 20 years old when that picture was taken. All right, with that, let's jump into the story. It's chapter 15, and in a sense, this is a continuation of the making of a bootlegger story, and it's called One Door Closes, Another Opens. If you remember, Paul had just been rejected to Santa Clara University, where he had applied. Paul was a big fish dreaming in a small soccer pond, rudely awakened when Santa Clara selected more talented strikers. Of all the universities he visited, Santa Clara was his first choice. Duke also had a beautiful campus with a chapel at its center. But Paul, who began his sales career peddling tobacco, turned against it, criticizing Duke as tainted by tobacco money reaped from predatory marketing nicotine addiction that claimed the lives of his grandparents and millions of others, and stunk up his close weekends. Would he rather be associated with the tobacco baron, or walk in the steps of Father Junipero Serra, who laid the cornerstone of the mission at Santa Clara's heart? After rereading the athletic department's rejection, he opened a second letter from Santa Clara, accepting him as a non-scholarship student. Paul was enamored with Santa Clara and the opportunity to study in Silicon Valley in the school's business program, so he abandoned his World Cup ambitions. He shared the bittersweet news with his parents, and looking at the bright side, the three went to Chez Jacques to celebrate with a bottle of Reims Cordon Bleu and a rack of lamb paired with Chateauneuf de Pape. Having the door close on his soccer career opened the door for Paul to travel, because he didn't need to report for summer practice. Paul wrote the admissions director thanking her for admission, and proposed he delay entering school a semester to visit Europe, to better prepare for life as a student and a career in international business. She gave her blessing to start in January, when the university had empty slots to fill, since some students graduated early. Paul's theory about asking permission worked until his 50th year, when he applied to San Diego County's government for a winery tasting room permit. His mother took him to a tarot card reader, and the cards indicated travel to Europe would be good. He worked full-time that summer at Chez Jacques to save money, and when his friends went off to college, he boarded a Pan Am flight to London. With connecting flights from London to Paris delayed to eternity or cancelled because of an air traffic control strike, he took a train to Victoria Station, another train to the White Cliffs of Dover, which he couldn't see because it was dark, an overnight boat ride across the English Channel — he slept on a bench on deck — a train ride to Paris, figured out the metro, and arrived exhausted at the apartment of Madame Mary-France Smith, a friend of his parents. Bob Smith moved to Paris on an exploratory mission to research opportunities for Disney in Europe, his second sojourn on the continent. He arrived for his first visit on a landing craft in June 1944 and returned to the U.S. with a bride. Shortly after Bob and Mary France returned to Paris, They bought a cottage in Normandy, but before they completed renovations, Bob, who survived the invasion of Normandy, dropped dead on the streets of Paris from a heart attack, barely 50 years old. God, life is short. Paul had vague recollections of visiting the Smiths when they lived in Los Angeles, but Mary France remembered changing Paul's diapers and feeding him escargot. His French mother brought him to a cafe to introduce him to croque monsieur, cheese toast, the croque madame with an egg, and café express, where he tasted his first real espresso, at a time when Starbucks was one store selling roasted beans and American coffee was percolated brown water. They walked to an outdoor food market where Paul gazed at the butcher's hogshead with protruding tusks, wild pheasant with bright red and green plumage, quail whose soft feathers he stroked, and the fishmonger, and fish eyes stared straight dead at him. Mary France purchased a kilogram of mussels. Placing them at the bottom of a wheeled cart, she pulled along the sidewalk, filling it with chanterelle mushrooms, fennel, endive, and radicchio. They sampled cheeses from the fromager, a runny camembert, a soft goat cheese, something stinky, something sweet. They walked into a boulangerie, and Mary France brought him a pain chocolat. Say hello to mon petit américain, always introducing Paul as her little American. She showed him how to carry baguettes under his armpit. They approached an outdoor cafe with a sign, Fruits de mer. Does that mean fruit of the sea? Paul asked. Oui. Do you eat huîtres? Mary France asked. What's that? Oysters. I love them. Let's manger un peu, she said, ordering a tray of oysters on ice and 2 glasses of sauterne. As he slurped down the mollusk, she said, You remind me of your father. He loves oysters and enjoyed eating here when he visited. What are those black spiky things? Paul asked. Oursin. A bear? No, dear, a bear is ours. This is oursin, sea urchin. What's that? You should try. She ordered oursin and spread orange gonads across a piece of white baguette like butter. He loved the sweet, salty taste. Your French is not very good, she observed. It was a comment he was to hear many times from her. What's wrong with the schools in the States these days? Nothing. I don't believe it. We're having so many problems here. Les immigrés, les noirs, les arabes. Oh mon Dieu, France is changing. Back at the apartment, Mary France showed Paul how to steam moule in butter, white wine, and garlic, and used the brine, some of which she saved to make soup the next day, as the base for a pasta sauce, and served it with riz de lapin, a stringy rabbit pâté. She lived with 2 Yorkshire Terriers and welcomed the opportunity to share her knowledge. She taught him how to braise a rabbit, then flavor it with sauce moutarde by whisking crème fraîche and Dijon mustard with the drippings, how to singe quails with flaming cognac, how to prepare and cook a quiche, how to transform a glass of white wine into the delightful aperitif kir with a touch of purple crème de cassis, a black currant liquor, or mûr, a blackberry liquor, and for more special occasions, a kir royal with champagne. Paul's later version of kir was mixing fresh grape juice from his vineyard with beer on a hot day. She paired wines from all regions of France with the dishes they made and cheeses they chose, and when she saw his clothes piling up, she taught him how to wash them using the funky French-designed machine à laver. Mary France drove Paul to her country house in Normandy, over 200 years old and made of stone. They visited the village's cemetery to place flowers at the tombstone engraved Bob, 1922 to 1976, and Mary France, with the date of her death left blank. Mary France's 80-year-old neighbor was Monsieur Chevalier, who lived with his 60-year-old mistress and showed Paul his pear trees, upon whose branches he tied bottles. At the end of the growing season, he harvested the embottled pears and added a clear eau de vie, creating a pear liqueur. The local distilled specialties were noyau de Vernon, made from apricot pits they affectionately called Laetrile, and Calvados, made by distilling apple mash the work performed by a distiller who traveled from farm to farm with his still, performing a house call distilling service, so each family had a personal supply. Monsieur Chevalier invited Paul and Mary France for a tour of his cellar. They sampled the poire per le coeur, and the Frenchman was delighted. Le Petit Américain enjoyed it. Monsieur dusted off an unmarked bottle and poured a sample for both. "May I have some more?" asked Paul, who liked the strong licorice taste. "I don't want you to go blind," chuckled the Frenchman. "It's absinthe." Monsieur showed Paul and Mary France racks of bottles, a library of wine stacked against the wall. "Pick one for your dinner, s'il vous plaît," the Frenchman offered Paul. "Any one you like." "I have no idea what to choose. Please pick one for us." "Quel âge a lui, Monsieur Chevalier?" asked Mary France. "À 18 ans," she replied. He did a quick calculation in his head and selected a bottle. "Ooh la la," said Mary France. Paul read the label. "Grand Cru Classé, Pomerol, 1959, the year I was born. How thoughtful." He hesitated. I don't want to take your best wine. You should keep it." Monsieur Chevalier insisted, saying, "I can't drink much red wine anymore. It hurts my stomach. I want you to enjoy it. When you drink it, look for the taste of tobacco." "Tobacco?" asked Paul, incredulous. "Oui, tobacco is characteristic of this wine." That evening, over coq au vin with Mary France, who instructed him to braise the chicken in the pot before adding other ingredients, including a cup of wine, they opened the Pomerol, and Paul was surprised. "Oh, it really does taste like tobacco," and he recalled the smoky, leathery taste of cigarettes he smoked as a child. After dinner, they walked outside, admiring the orange glow of the setting sun, the low clouds, and birds that darted in and out, snatching insects with the grace of lightning-quick fairies. He asked Mary France what kind of birds they were. "Hirondelles," she replied. "Swallows." "Swallows! I love them. When you visited us as a child, you took my salt shaker outside and tried to catch birds by putting salt on their tails." "I'm still drying," and he pulled an imaginary salt shaker from his pocket and ran towards the bird, calling, "Swallow, swallow, viens ici, come here," as Mary France laughed at his antics. Keen to explore more of Europe, Paul activated his Euro pass and boarded a train for Lyon, France's gastronomic stomach, where he found a $20 hotel room and wine for $2 a bottle. He was on a student budget, so when he ate dinner, he ordered the house vin de table, usually a Côte de Rhône. He drank so much Côte de Rhône, it became synonymous with jug wine and nothing special. He missed the evolution taking place behind gates of wineries he passed but didn't visit. In almost everything Paul did, he was nearby at the creation, but missed the opportunity. He attended college in Silicon Valley, but wasn't hired by Intel or Apple. When he passed through Vacheras and Gigondas, he didn't meet the young winemakers, just a few years older than he, breaking the mold of French winemaking. After a day walking through rows of purple lavender whose scent sent him to a dream, he traveled to Mougins on the Riviera. He didn't meet Picasso, although he dreamed he painted with Picasso in his studio. From there, he took a train to Munich, where he ordered beer by the liter at the Hofbrauhaus and learned 3.8 liters equals 1 gallon, a useful conversion when filling out his annual government reports on wine production and sales. Drinking 3 beers quickly here wasn't a good idea. As the Oompa band played and pubgoers sang, Paul felt himself occupying a point on an infinite historical timeline. His father was born in 1932, the same year Hitler became chancellor, his early power base at the very spot Paul sipped beer. He shuddered, then went outside into the Glockenspiel courtyard. He recalled what his junior high school studies teacher taught about Hitler's rise and the use of the big lie, repeatedly telling audacious untruths, so unbelievable that after time and repetition, people began to accept. Thank goodness we live in modern times and this could never happen again, Paul wrote in his journal. As Paul walked Munich streets, it occurred to him Rachel's great-uncle's shop was vandalized on Kristallnacht close by, and soon thereafter their apartment looted, and a whole branch of her family deported, murdered, and burned in ovens. He shuddered again, recalling images of liberated death camps, mass graves, and walking skeletons. Any one of them could have been a Rachel or her family. Whatever happened to her? And the nice elderly people I meet on trains and in the beer hall, where were they during all this? He decided to leave Munich and took a tram back to the Jugendherberger youth hostel to gather his things and noticed the magnificent white tents of the Olympic Stadium, and in his state of historical flashbangs recalled events 5 years before, just 5 short years, when Palestinian terrorists seized the Israeli athletes' dormitory, resulting in the deaths of 11 hostages and a German policeman during the 1972 Olympics. Paul took an inner-city Zug to Mainz, walked to the Rhine, sat on a damp bench chewing cold bread, cold herring, a wedge of cold Gouda cumin cheese, and sipped warm beer. He watched the water and ships move along, he, a vessel on a river of time. He boarded a boat to Cologne, a city he wanted to visit, as his parents practically played Keith Jarrett's Cologne concert piano recital non-stop, sat in the passenger's cabin and ordered the Rhine wine, and as he drank, wrote in his journal, "The wine is sweet. Dad wouldn't like it, but I do. Reminds me of Liebfraumilch, dear wife's milk. This isn't the milk I grew up with, but perhaps it's the milk and honey of Rhinelanders. I thought German babies suckled on nipple bottles of beer. It's as if nothing happened, and yet so much happened. People are friendly to me, but Germany is giving me the creeps. I like the wine. It's different than French wine. Germany doesn't have a reputation for good wine, but why not? The slopes are so steep. How do people walk up and down those slopes? Just met Petra from Dusseldorf. She's so beautiful. I'm going to Dusseldorf after visiting the site of the Cologne concert. I think I'll marry a German." Mist of melancholic fog seeped into his head, followed by clouds of solitude from traveling alone, his loneliness magnified by alcohol, the ghosts of history, and the gurgling, bubbling, rippling sounds of eddies along the river's edge. He swallowed the last sip from the tall brown bottle and walked to the ship's rail to admire the steep hillsides of manicured vineyards, and was transported from dark images of the Third Reich to a fairy-tale land of castles and terraced slopes. How do they pick grapes on these steep hills? And as the thoughts, questions, and dreams of fine Rhine wine flowed through his head, Paul passed through an area where high above the river, once upon a time, a beautiful woman named Lorelei was perched upon the cliffs, whose voice, more pleasing than that of a songbird, put delirious thoughts into sailors' heads. Her songs and golden locks caused men to ignore treacherous obstacles, crashing their ships upon the rocks where they floundered in swift currents until they could no longer keep their heads above water. Did the call of an ancient siren cause Paul to plant vines? What I know is this. When I returned from a trip to a unified Germany searching for part of my past, Paul opened a bottle of Rhine wine for me, and after the second glass, told me the songs he heard in his vineyard resembled the music he heard when traveling along the Rhine in his youth. "I have to tell you something," he confided after the fourth glass. "Lorelei was a grapevine, and she brought destruction upon all those enchanted by her songs." Outside the reach of Lorelei, beyond the magical music of Vines von der Rhine, Paul reached the depths of loneliness as he sat in a train's cabin by himself, tracks echoing, all alone, all alone, all alone, from Dusseldorf all the way to Paris. In his stream of historical consciousness, Paul thought about his birth year, and how 100 years before he was born, just 100 years, his family and the nation were on the verge of civil war, whose aftermath permeates the nation's psyche to this day. Civil war, World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam. I've grown up in peace. Is peace the aberration? From the Gare du Nord station, he took the metro to Gare Saint-Lazare, observing the stone metro faces of Parisians, reminding him of blank eyes from the fishmonger's catch. He boarded a train to Normandy for a farewell visit to Merry France, and noticed an open seat opposite a young woman, which he was apt to do, having made friends with Swedes, Finns, Germans, Swiss, and Dutch on trains during his voyage. She must be French, he thought, as she had a fair complexion and wore a blue dress, white sweater, and her hair braided in an interlocking pattern unfamiliar to him. It was a French braid. And she stared straight ahead, a Parisian metro face with dead fish eyes, ignoring him. Bonjour, said Paul. Est-ce qu'il y a quelqu'un? Anyone sitting here? He asked in a thick American accent. Non, asseyez-vous. Sit down, she replied with a Parisian accent. Where are you from? She asked in perfect English, surprising him. He, from San Diego. She, Stratford, Connecticut. What are you doing here? She, taking courses in art history. He, traveling through Europe before starting college. Where are you going? She, to Rouen to see the cathedral and pay tribute to Joan of Arc. He, do you hear voices? She, only in my dreams. And you? He, no, not telling her about the ghosts from Germany's past. She, and where are you headed? He, on the way to visit his French mother. She, relieved to be getting away from her host family a few days, where the mistress of the house fed table scraps to the dog on the same plate served to her, the thought of sharing her dishes with the dog's tongue, even after being washed, revolting. He, planning to go to Paris next week for 2 days. Since you're an art history major, would you like to visit the Louvre? She, give me a call when you're back in Paris, writing down the telephone number of her host family. He, exiting the train at Vernon, where Mary France waited with her Peugeot and yappy Yorkies. He waves to her from the platform as the train departs, then driven to the house in the country. From the depths of depression brought on by travel fatigue, Paul's life took on an upwards trajectory, for things got better and better from the moment he met Sheila. 2 days later, Paul wrote a letter to her describing the country village, how glad he was they had met, and descriptions of the markets he visited with Mary France, the meals they cooked, the wines they drank. When he returned to Paris, his upward trajectory was boosted by meeting Sheila at the Louvre, about which Paul only knew the Mona Lisa, Winged Victory, and the statue of Venus de Milo, whose shapely poitrine, he noticed, was similar to his American guide's. As they ambled down one of the grand halls, she drew attention to the romantic Rococo period landscapes painted by the Frenchman Jean-Honoré Fragonard, and from that unforgettable day, the artist's name was embedded in Paul's memory. And 30 years later, when wife and husband watched the sunset from the top of the hill, as the sky turned the right shade of indigo and cumulus clouds reflected the peach glow of the sun's last rays, he would say to her, "Doesn't it look like a Fragonard painting?" And he sighed when he remembered their first date and how he had longed for her. "You told me that already," she sighed in return, remembering the promising career she abandoned for her children. With the air of melancholy Paul had felt traveling through Europe alone until he met her, for she was alone, living in the country, her only companions a dog and 2,000 vines. After Paul's art history lesson, they purchased a sandwich jambon, some Gruyere cheese, baguette, riz de lapin, a bottle of $2 wine, and picnicked in the Tuileries garden. After lunch, they walked to a cafe. He ordered a calvados, she a pastis, as absinthe had not yet made its comeback. And he asked about her plans after graduation. "I want to work at Sotheby's," she answered, and Paul, who had no idea what he wanted to do, had never met anyone so focused on her career. He had a vague idea of traveling, next time with a companion, perhaps someone like her. Over the next few years, they exchanged occasional letters and even fewer phone calls, as international calls were $2 per minute, when the minimum wage was less than $2 per hour. If Paul had taken a gap year instead of a semester, who knows what roads he would have followed, and if he would even return to the U.S. But with a self-imposed schedule of flying home in December to start college in January, he arrived with a changed outlook. Whereas freshmen at Santa Clara were excited to be away from home and drink, Paul cared less than an ant's life about drinking beer, having done that since he was 16. Santa Clara's soccer team carried on without him, reaching the NCAA tournament the next 2 years, with Paul providing play-by-play commentary from the stands. By then, he didn't care about an activity that once consumed him. He had moved on and learned what's important to you today may mean nothing to you tomorrow. He followed his interests in international relations, languages, and business. Mary France advised, "Study the language of your enemy," and her children studied German. As Paul looked at the world scene, he saw West Germany as an ally, and every German he met during his travels spoke English. Since Japan was ascending as the world's second largest economy, and because of his experience drinking sake with his father's Japanese colleagues, he decided to study Japanese. For all the intelligence Paul demonstrated learning foreign languages, Sheila complained he couldn't change a light bulb. In fact, he could change the bulb, but had trouble with the fixtures. After graduation, Paul flew to Paris for adventure before starting work, and went to Normandy to see Mary France. Also visiting was Father Wood, chaplain of the 82nd Airborne Division and a friend of the Smiths, who parachuted the eve of D-Day into Saint-Mère-Église. Father Wood returned to France to christen Mary France's grandchild, and on June 6, Paul drove Father to the landing beaches to learn history from one who was there. They stopped at Saint-Mère-Église, where Father Wood explained how they used cricket noisemakers to communicate. "You can see that in the scene in the movie The Longest Day," he told Paul. Then Father Wood pointed to the church steeple, where a comrade's chute stuck, leaving him helpless as a bird hanging in a net. He was lucky to survive. 16,000 didn't. As they approached the coast, Paul saw the sea of white crosses marking the final resting place of fallen soldiers. They parked and walked silently down the rows, Paul following the priest, leaving him to his thoughts. The morning ceremonies were over, but they saw wreaths decorating the stage where dignitaries stood at attention 2 hours before. Father Wood walked to a hill and showed Paul a pillbox used by a German machine gun battery to mow down soldiers on the beach with the swiftness Paul cut down weeds, swinging his shovel. "It was so terrible," Mary France told Paul after they returned. "All those boys killed. They were so young. Many of them your age or younger. Any one of them could have been my Bob. They are all heroes." "How did you meet your husband?" Paul asked. "After the war, my father escorted my sister and I to a dance for Paris for GIs, and we met there. I was just 18. I was lucky. He was such a good man." They ate and drank, and Paul found his head bobbing on the table. "Take a nap over there," said Mary France, pointing to a couch. "Your father took a nap there after a big lunch when visiting with your mother." And so Paul learned the art of the siesta after a meal with wine. After a week with Mary France, he met his parents in Paris. Before Paul's return to the U.S. to search for work, his father suggested they visit Champagne country. They sped down the autoroute de l'Est in a rental car, 160 miles per hour towards Reims and the monastery of Dom Pérignon, and decided to take back roads for a closer look at this scenic countryside. They approached a vineyard and stopped for photographs. Jimmy walked to a vine laden with grapes, took some into his hand, and as Paul's mother snapped a photo, his father said to his son, "Someday when I retire, I'd like to own a vineyard." Paul returned to Silicon Valley, registered with the temp agency, and temped at several companies, including Sun Microsystems, where he was a part-time clerk filing import and export documents in the International Logistics Department. He expected the position to lead to an opportunity in international marketing, and after 3 months, his manager told him the permanent staff member had returned from maternity leave, and Paul was no longer needed. Disappointed and needing a job, He used Santa Clara's placement office and found a position at Software Publishing Corp., the developer of Harvard Graphics, an earlier precursor to PowerPoint. Paul was an entry-level marketing assistant writing user guides, data sheets, and eventually assisted with packaging design and advertising. He heard about a Japanese language Toastmasters group that met at Adobe Systems and intended to practice Japanese. The group included several international product managers from Adobe, impressed with Paul's language skills. He had found a Japanese girlfriend to tutor him, and eventually offered him a position in their technology licensing department. It was 1985, the year Apple introduced the laser printer, which licensed Adobe's PostScript technology that allowed the printer to generate high-quality type and graphics. Paul joked he didn't launch the Mac, but he enabled desktop publishing. Paul supported the team that licensed Adobe's technology to Japanese printer manufacturers. It was good business. Japan was approaching its economic zenith. Adobe, a great place to work with a break room stocked with soft drinks, snacks, and beer, grew rapidly, and so did Paul's responsibilities. He loved work and began making business trips to Tokyo. When Sheila transferred from Sotheby's New York office to San Francisco, she and Paul met and spent a day exploring art galleries and walking through neighborhoods with colorful Victorian homes. They found a cafe, ordered espressos, reminisced about their adventures in Europe, while Paul described the excitement and bustle of Tokyo. They married a year later, prompted by Sheila's pregnancy. While Carrie-Anne knew every tasting room in Napa and was often comped free tastings, demonstrating her cougar powers of persuasion at a kitten's age. When Paul and Sheila embarked on their first excursion to wine country, Kate had a meltdown as they drove across the San Mateo Bridge. "We gotta turn back," said Sheila. "I can't stay in the car with a screaming baby. She'll stop in a minute. Let me out." "Hang on, we're on a bridge. Let me out," said Sheila, opening the car door. Paul braked swiftly before Sheila jumped and convinced her to stay inside until they crossed the bridge, where he pulled over and she stepped out for fresh air. After Kate stopped crying, they drove home and never visited Napa. While Paul was gaining experience in Asia, his father and mother moved to Paris in 1987 to assist with the construction and launch of Euro Disneyland. Leroy also transferred with his family to France to support the initiative. The two expatriate families met for dinner at Chez Haines, which served Paris' best soul food. Leroy ordered a bottle of wine, and the steward poured him a sample to test. Leroy swished it around his mouth, inhaled, literally gargled, oohed and ahed, then downed it, telling the astonished waiter, "Take it back, and bring me something better." He was joking, of course, and performed a similar ceremony at top-rated Maxime's, where he asked the waiter about an expensive wine. "Is it good?" "The best in all of France. Will it get us drunk?" His name was derived from French, Leroy, meaning the king, and he was the indisputable barbecue king of the American community in Paris. Jimmy and Leroy and their youngest children were close as white on rice, close as black on the ace of spades. They shared similar upbringings, both served in the army, both dedicated to their Disney careers. They were opposite sides of the same coin, opposite rails of the same track. One family traced its roots to Africa. Jimmy said his father's family tree was mongrel and untraceable. Leroy's oldest daughter, Keisha, grew up with an abundance of caution towards white folk, had already graduated from Hampton University, and was working as a congressional aide. She would go on to play a key role in President Obama's White House, shepherding healthcare legislation behind the scenes. Sometimes dreams are fulfilled by our children. A few of Jimmy's colleagues assumed because he was Southern, he held the same disdain for African Americans they did, but quickly found if they included him in off-color racial jokes or derogatory comments, they earned contempt from a senior executive. With cash from profitable operations, Adobe continued growing and acquired other companies. With growth came change, and Paul felt hindered by increasing bureaucracy and began thinking about changing companies for promotion and pay increase now that he had a family and wanted to buy a house. In 1993, Paul's father accepted an early retirement package prompted by Euro Disney's poor opening performance and moved back to San Diego. He mailed his son an article from the Union Tribune about an up-and-coming company that developed a method for compressing telephone signals, allowing wireless carriers to increase the number of calls they could handle with better quality. Code Division Multiple Access was invented by Dr. Irwin Jacobs, a University of California San Diego professor turned entrepreneur who founded Qualcomm. CDMA would prove valuable to the emerging wireless communications industry by making costly infrastructure more efficient and improving call quality. Paul went to Santa Clara's library to research Qualcomm, confirmed its patent positions were strong, and learned several overseas manufacturers had already licensed its technology. He arranged an interview, was hired, and within a month was on a plane to Tokyo with the Qualcomm team to license CDMA to Japanese mobile handset manufacturers. For Paul, it was an ideal position, allowing him to move his family to San Diego, where he could afford a house and be near his parents. Not only was Paul able to leverage his business know-how and know-who in Japan, Qualcomm's largest potential market and biggest challenge was China, an opportunity for Paul to expand his horizons. Paul made frequent trips to Beijing and Shanghai, using long hours on the plane to study Chinese. The work was hard, but he enjoyed his colleagues, experienced a different culture, eating real Chinese food, and observing a country with over 1 billion citizens develop before his eyes. Each year, Paul noticed upgraded office furnishings, better clothes, new buildings, more cars, and an explosion of mobile phones. The Chinese he met had a thirst for knowledge, whereas Japanese customers thought they knew everything, except Qualcomm's trade secrets. He enjoyed sightseeing excursions on weekends, and found the Chinese language easier to learn than Japanese. His Japanese knowledge gave him a head start on Chinese, as most Chinese words are based on Chinese characters. Paul needed help learning correct pronunciation, tricky for a big-nosed foreigner. Fortunately, almost everyone he met in China was a willing teacher. One Sunday afternoon, heading back to Shanghai from Hangzhou, where he had met an emerging internet company called Alibaba, the only seat he could book was a hard seat on a slow local train, packed, standing room only. The train's floor was greasy, the toilet reeked, and he was dreading the 5-hour ride. He ordered 2 beers, chugged the first, and as he sipped the second, the beer kicked off an attitude adjustment. "Where are you from?" asked a woman in her early 20s, dressed in well-made clothes who sat across from him. 我是美国人. You speak Chinese? 一点点, a little. 你手口语很好. You speak Chinese well, she said with a warm smile. The farmer next to her, wearing a Mao suit, flashed gold teeth, enjoying the conversation. Paul ordered him a beer. He offered Paul a swig from his bottle of Baijiu, Chinese vodka, and Paul took it. He stole a glance at the woman. She was, in a word, 漂亮. She had a clean, pearly white complexion, black shoulder-length hair permed straight, and the best teeth he had seen among 10,000 faces. He learned over 150 Chinese words and expressions from his new teachers. "I enjoyed talking with you," Paul said as the train pulled into Shanghai Station. "When I come back to Shanghai, perhaps we can meet for a cup of tea." "I'd like that," she said, eager to practice English with a native speaker. Paul took the language book on whose blank pages he scribbled the words he learned and asked, "Please write your name and mobile phone number." I don't have a telephone. Only working girls have those. I have a beeper." "Someday soon, everyone in China will have a mobile phone. That's what my company does." "If you bring me a phone, I'll buy you tea," she said with an enticing smile. "I've heard every woman in China is looking for a boyfriend who will give her a phone and a passport." "Not me. I plan to buy my own phone." She wrote 2 pictographs in the book and her page's number. "How do you pronounce your name?"
Lanwa. What does it mean? Orchid. But you may use my English name. What's that? Christine. What's your name? Paul. What does it mean?
I don't know. I'm named after a person in the Bible.
Then you must be a good man.
He hunted and killed Christians.
Have you come to China to help police hunt Christians?
No.
Would you like me to give you a Bible?
You have? There's one in the drawer of my hotel room,
he said, inviting her to join him at the terrace cafe of the Portman Shangri-La Hotel, where bamboo bird cages housing singing parakeets, lovebirds, and canaries sang from the ceiling. After tea, he invited her to his room for the Bible, handed it to her, then escorted her down the elevator, past the guards, and hailed a cab.
"Zaijian," she waved. "See you again."
"I hope so," she said.
Meet again, they did. He, flying over the Sea of Japan to meet her for a night. She, teaching him a great many things about Chinese culture, some behind closed doors, others outside, such as the time they hiked to the isolated, crumbling end of the Great Wall of China and found themselves alone. When Qualcomm established a joint venture with the Japanese firm Sony to build mobile handsets in San Diego, Paul, with his Japan experience and strong cross-cultural communication skills, was well suited to join the venture, but didn't realize he would lose the stock options his colleagues who stayed at Qualcomm kept. Moreover, regarding Qualcomm shares he owned outright, unlike Carrie Ann, who had the system and discipline to take winnings off the table, Paul insisted on holding for the long term. Despite Sheila's pleas to sell when the stock soared, Paul held and painfully watched most of the gains that would have made him financially secure evaporate. Still, he salvaged enough to leave Qualcomm, buy a modest house in the country, take time off to renovate, clear the land, and plant vines. If you asked Paul why he planted a vineyard, he'd say, "I grew up with wine. I live in California, and that's the natural thing to do." Undoubtedly true, but I say it's because his father once said, "I'd like to plant a vineyard when I retire." It wouldn't surprise me if his daughter and son plant vines of their own someday. Then there was Sheila, who stomped grapes during her sojourn in France in her youth. What about Bluey? Let's ask the dog, the smartest of them all. "Bluey, why did you plant a vineyard and start making wine?" "Woof! To sniff bitches' buttses." "Woof!